to have you here today, so I appreciate you taking the time. This is a great opportunity for the interns and people going through the program to just get a deeper look at what it's like to really learn from the true professionals. So I'm just a little pawn, but you are the teacher of the real teachers. So thank you for taking your time. We're excited to learn about some gas.
All right, well, I appreciate that. In this series of talks, lectures, lessons, whatever, we'll do a quick intro to training. We'll look at 5 major training principles, maybe 6, depending upon what you all feel like you want to learn about periodization. Few additional training principles, and throughout that we'll have some applications. And so I do invite you to stop me at any time if you have any questions. I'd like this to be as interactive as we can make it, and I'll try to make it as interactive as I can. But should you have questions, should you want further explanation, should you want to to get into the weeds with some application, by all means, I dig that. So definitely stop me and speak up if you do. So all right, here we go. Some notes on training really quick. So training is the process of preparing someone, whether that be physically, technically, tactically, psychologically, theoretically, to the highest levels of performance. A lot of this comes from work that's been done in athletes, but we can apply it really to anyone that you are working with, whether they do have athletic endeavors, or whether they are general population, or geriatrics, or special populations, so on and so forth. Because really, everyone has a goal, or they should have some sort of goal in mind that they want to achieve. And so training is really just the process of leading them toward that goal in a logical and safe manner. Within this, a theoretical model, so a plan, guides a set of real-world objectives, intermediate goals, making the vision, that long-term goal, manageable and achievable. So you start with your client or athletes or patients' long-term goal, their vision, what they want to achieve, how they want to see themselves, how they want to perform. And then you work backwards, setting some intermediate goals. Now, you may not be able to set all the intermediate goals at once, because not everyone adapts and progresses at the same rate. We know there's huge inter-individual differences, or everyone responds a little bit differently to training and nutrition. And also that vision may change along the way based upon the progress the person's making. And sometimes, people start out wanting just general fitness, and then they want more. But either way, we set a series of intermediate goals, maybe 3 months to 6 months, maybe up to a year with some more advanced clients, and then plan to achieve those goals. Now, the training means follow predictable directions of adaptation. So what this means is that if you train someone for aerobic fitness on a treadmill, they're going to become better at running. Their aerobic fitness is going to improve. And if you train someone for muscle hypertrophy in their biceps using curls, then they're going to grow bigger, stronger biceps, and so on and so forth. So there is a science to this. And this is our hard bed in our Goldilocks. If you remember the Goldilocks tale of Goldilocks and the 3 bears, one bed is too hard, one bed is too soft, one bed is just right. So the hard bed of training is the empirical and the evidence-based. Empirical refers to data or observation driven. So this would be what you've read in your textbooks, what you learn from myself and other presenters. maybe some studies that you've read or come across. All your background research provides you with the hard bed of training, how to design training programs based upon evidence. But also, we know that no two people respond the same. Even twins don't respond the same to training. And this is what we call, what I refer to, I should say, as the soft bed, the experience and subjective response. Some of your clients will require different levels of motivation or different tactics in terms of how you're going to motivate them. Some of them may be more intrinsically motivated than others. Some of them are going to respond different than others. Some may have pre-existing conditions or limitations that you will need to work around. And all of this requires experience on your part, experience working with real clients, real people. And so this is what I like to think of as the Goldilocks problem of training. We need to kind of find the bed that's just right in between. I pulled this figure out of Advanced Strength and Conditioning textbook. And I really like it. And I think we can apply it beyond just strength and conditioning and to personal trainers as well. Because in personal training, like the hard bed and the soft bed, on the left, you have the soft bed, the coaching aspect of it, the experience, the subjective responses. And on the right-hand side, where you see applied science, you have the hard bed, the empirical, the evidence-based, and you need to combine the two. So from the coaching side of things, you need some knowledge in terms of interpersonal communication. You need to set some outcomes as well that are not purely physical performance driven. Maybe client's competence or their ability and confidence and able to do an exercise. And also the context of who you're working with. And on the right-hand side, we have all the pretty well-known evidence-based or empirical applied science aspects. And as a coach, it's up to you to combine these two things. Some more notes on training. I like to differentiate between planning or periodization and programming. And we'll see this kind of pop up too as we go through these training principles. So some considerations related to planning and periodization. If you are working with athletes, then peaking will be one of your considerations. We want that athlete or individual to reach the highest level of their specific performance for whatever outcome or sport or event they're competing in at the right time. But for everyone, we need to consider fatigue management, not just the fatigue of training, but also the fatigue of life. Because most of the people that we work with are not professional athletes who have unlimited resources. They have jobs, families, financial stressors, etc. Injury prevention, minimizing injury, and monitoring. How are we going to monitor outcomes and responses? In periodization, we also think about timelines, and often we can break those timelines into macro cycles. So long-term goals or long-term objectives, 6 months to 2, 3, 4 years if it's an Olympic athlete. Mesocycles, these intermediate objectives, usually months, 1 month, 2 month. Microcycles, so typically a week, and then daily. And if you are working with athletes, then we're often considering the phases of our training as well. Starting with general or preparatory phase, general physical preparation, moving into more specific phases, and ultimately into some sort of competition or realization of peak performance. Now, on the programming side of things, before we get there, what don't you see under planning and periodization? Like if you're going to set up a workout for a client, what is missing from this?
Maybe the after, like the adaptations or how to deal with those.
Okay, tell me more.
Like when they start seeing results, like if we're talking about like a general population, maybe, because I wouldn't really plan for like really far in advance for someone who's just starting out. So maybe when they start to see adaptations, like where you go from there. I feel like I'm around it, but not maybe hitting the nail on the head.
Okay, yeah, no, that would definitely fall under planning and periodization. The rate of adaptations that you would expect. Absolutely. Because we're certainly going to expect, at least in terms of strength, much faster adaptations in someone who is relatively novice compared to someone who is advanced. What else? What else don't we see here that you would want to know or would need to include if you're setting up a workout?
Maybe their history, medical history.
Sure, yeah, we should definitely take that into consideration. Yep. Anything else you feel like we're missing? Okay. Oh, active rest, yeah. But under programming, we're thinking about time and schedule management. Again, when can your client train? How many days a week? What time of day? How much time can they devote? Maybe some planned overreaching. We're working with more advanced individuals. Tapering, if the person's competing. How to achieve these three things. But really, when we think about programming, we think about the training variables. And this is usually where people go first when they start setting up a workout for someone. They think about the frequency, the density, the loads that are used, the volume and intensity, so the exercises, the sets, the reps. So oftentimes when people set up programs, and I see this in my students as well, this is what they immediately go into is what are the exercises going to be, what sets, what reps, maybe the intensity, the rest periods. And I sit down with them and I ask them, what is the objective here? What are we trying to achieve with this particular person? And where do we want to go with this? And usually that's where some confusion sets in, or a lack of confidence or a lack of experience. So I hope that in these lessons, I give you the knowledge and experience and confidence to increase your foresight in planning, training, and programming. To be able to start with a large goal and think backwards and have some ideas or some knowledge of expected adaptations and responses. As we go through this, it's going to go from pretty general in these training principles to more specific, to more applied. So if you're not a fan of the theoretical, bear with me. We'll get there. And these training principles now are concepts that have filtered down in sports science. And really since maybe like the 40s or 50s, when we started paying attention to training. And depending upon the textbook, there's different numbers, but I think there's 5 really that are most appropriate across the board for any client, whether they are general population, special population, or athletes. And these are those 5, with the 6th one being specific more to more intermediate to advanced individuals. And we're going to go over all these, but it's stimulus, recovery, adaptation, overload, specificity, variation, and fatigue management. With probably number 2 and number 3 being the most important. Before we cover them, we need to talk about general adaptation syndrome. So we're going to spend a little bit of time covering this so that it makes sense, so that you have an understanding of the framework in which some of these other principles come from. General adaptation syndrome was first published by Hans Selye in 1936. So this idea is nearly 80 years old, or over 80 years old. It's been around for a while. And what we look at here is some very commonalities among all sorts of stressors in terms of how we respond and how we adapt. The stressor comes from the external environment, some sort of homeostatic disturbance, or some sort of stress. That results in a change in the internal environment and the organism's drive to reestablish homeostasis with a number of different reactions. And we see those reactions have some commonalities based upon the stress. Now, that stress could be exposure to cold or heat, for that matter. It could be sublethal doses of drugs, some sort of injury, or, as we're most concerned with, the stress of exercise, excessive muscular exercise. Or when we say excessive, something that is above what the organism can normally withstand, something that causes a stress and homeostatic disturbance. Again, that homeostatic disturbance, or that disturbance to baseline physiology, is met with a reaction to reestablish homeostasis. So the orange arrow going down, reducing the organism's capabilities, is met by some sort of rebalancing internally to reestablish homeostasis in the organism's abilities. Here is the most common schematic of the stress response adaptation, or of the general adaptation syndrome. Now, this model shows us the usual response to nearly any stimuli that can be marked by habituation or adaptation. Whether that stimuli is a drug or a chemical, or that stimuli is a physical stress, like a stress of exercise. Initially, there is an assault to our normal functioning physiology. That big red arrow that you see at the left of the screen. That assault causes changes to homeostasis or an alarm. And then we have a resistance to those changes that is met by adaptations. We see that in the stage of resistance. Now, should those assaults continue, eventually we'll reach a stage of exhaustion, whereby, if you see the black line, you can see that after a period of time, if we continue with those stressors and those assaults, the level of resistance starts to decline. In the case of some of Seeley's work, which was exposing mice to noxious agents, that exhaustion would ultimately result in death. And so general adaptation syndrome is the sum of all specific and non-specific systematic reactions which ensue upon long exposure to some sort of stress. Think about exercise really quick. What systems are affected by exercise? Just in general, whether that exercise is resistance or aerobic. What organ systems are affected?
Cardiovascular.
Cardiovascular is one, yeah.
Muscular.
Definitely muscular, yeah. Muscular.
Cardiorespiratory.
Okay, respiratory
I don't
system.
know. I'm just throwing stuff out there.
Keep going, you're right.
Neuromuscular. Like the brain.
Yeah, the central nervous system, the peripheral
CNS,
nervous
there you
system. Yep.
Thanks.
Yep.
Endocrine.
Yeah,
Endocrine.
that's hormones, right?
Correct.
Like balance. Is it vestibular? Is that one?
Possibly, sure.
Okay. Or I guess that's brain too, or a combination of.
Couldn't even say reproductive because of arousal.
Yep.
Kind of workouts are you doing over there, Chris? I don't know about that.
So we see that a number of systems are affected besides just what we would initially think of, muscles and cardiovascular. And so general adaptation syndrome describes the sum of all specific and non-specific systematic reactions. In other words, how the muscles are affected, endocrine system is affected, cardiovascular system is affected, endocrine system is affected. And I think on another slide, I have even more than that we'll get into. But it describes how they react and how they adapt based upon continued exposure to the stress. If we look at it more applied to training, then general adaptation syndrome looks a little more like this. And I really like this kind of series of quotes we have here. The first one from Nietzsche, "That which does not kill us makes us stronger," which is not always true. And then we have another one that says, "That which does not kill us makes us not stronger, but less sensitive." Think of that as the repeated bout effect. When you first do an exercise for the first time in a while, your muscle is going to be sore. But then, if you expose your muscle to that very same exercise, it will not be as sore after the second time you do it. Expose it again, it probably will not be sore at all. But if you keep doing the same thing, it's not going to get stronger. So that which makes us stronger is not that which does kill us. And then I like this kind of final wrap up from Chris. You're gonna have to tell me if I'm pronouncing this correct. Bret Contreras.
That sounds great to me.
I know you recognize the name. That which makes us stronger may be named training. All right, so here we have the training stimulus or the stressor at the far left. And that dip in performance level is what's known as the alarm phase. And this first stage, this alarm phase, is going to occur about 6 to 48 hours following the initial assault. So following the first exercise session, or I guess any exercise session of a significant stimulus, this alarm phase, this dip in performance, is going to occur for about 6 to 48 hours. The next stage, the recovery, adaptation, and preparation stage, as it's labeled here, is going to last for about 1 to 3 months. And this is assuming that the dose or injury, in other words, dose of exercise and level of muscular damage or injury, is relatively small and is marked by an increase in resistance or an adaptation. Now, after this time, resistance is going to be slowly lost and is going to succumb to the symptoms similar to the alarm stage. So if you've ever gone through a really intense training cycle and trained really hard for too long, and I mean too long, not in terms of like that single day, but weeks to months, you know, toward the end of that period, you might feel kind of run down. If you played sports, I like to reference sports in high school because a lot of people played sports in high school, but oftentimes toward the end of that season, you might feel a little bit beat up, a little run down, a little tired, a little fatigued. Your level of motivation may not be as high as it was at the beginning of the season. And so what we're seeing is symptoms similar to the alarm stage. Now, in 1950, I got a couple things here. Okay. So in these recovery, adaptation, and preparation, what we can see are there's going to be micro fluctuations. So this is in response to each workout, but ultimately, those training sessions should sum up to improved performance. However, if those training sessions are of too high of an intensity, too often, too frequently, we'll see these red dots at the left of the screen there, whereby performance does not return to baseline and it actually goes down. And that's what we see in the when we start to lose this resistance, this what might be termed overtraining or overreaching at the very least. And so, like I said, it was just a little historical perspective. It was 1959 when general adaptation syndrome was first used to explain why variation in training is necessary, why you cannot do the same thing over and over and over again and expect linear results. Not all sports scientists agreed on this from the onset because a lot of them argued that Seeley's work was in mouse models. But we do see very similar relationships. According to Verkhoshansky, the most important questions pertaining to general adaptation syndrome to ask, as they refer to the training process, are number one, what is a typical reaction of the athlete's body on the loads used during training and competitive activity? So remember, the stress of exercise, the response and the adaptation, they're systematic or systemic, I should say. So you may train the muscles, but other systems are going to be affected and are going to adapt. The neural system, the endocrine system, which we mentioned, the immune system will be affected. If you are individuals who are engaged in a high volume of training and are on the verge of overreaching, are often more susceptible to illness. We've already mentioned the cardiovascular system, but the renal system and the digestive system are all going to be affected. So what is the typical reaction of the individual to the loads used during training? Second question to ask yourself is, what level should the training loads be to provide a training effect? Who's heard of Mike Israetel? Are you familiar with that name? One person? Okay. Yep. So Mike Israetel uses some terms that I think really help to illustrate this, and we'll talk about them or reference them a little bit in this lesson as well, because I think they're just they're very intuitive terms. And so he uses minimal effective volume and maximal recoverable volume. Minimal effective volume is the least amount of volume that you need to do, or the least amount of work you need to do to make an adaptation. And then maximal recoverable volume being the most work that you can do to make adaptations that you can still recover from. In other words, the most work you can do that's not going to put you into this, I don't know why I'm pointing because you can't see me point to my screen. That's not going to put you into those red dots there that lead to overtraining. Training should fluctuate within this range. Where in this range should you train, and when should you train under or over this range? When do you think you should train under this range? So below this minimal effective volume.
Like a maintenance phase, or like maybe an injury.
Okay, yeah, the maintenance phase or an injury. Okay. Maybe also in a, have you heard the term deload?
Mhm.
Right, so
Yes, I've got one coming up.
so in a deload. And when do you think we should train over this range?
Is that what we would with the super compensation?
Yeah, that's right. So if we are trying to prepare an athlete for an event, or I should say advanced individuals, then we may, for a very short period of time, train above this range to reach a state of overreaching and allow the person to recover and then have super compensation. What factors affect the ability of an athlete to adapt? And when I say athlete, you can change that, insert just client, individual, yourself. What factors affect the ability of someone to adapt, specifically to exercise?
Just not being able to recover properly.
Okay. What can influence recovery?
I guess the frequency you're training, you know, their rest or recovery days, what they're doing, obviously nutrition and what they're doing outside of training plays a big part as far as sleep and stress and everything else. But yeah, I'll say that.
Yeah, exactly. So not just the training, which you as a professional are kind of in charge of, but a number of other factors affect someone's ability to adapt. Their nutrition, their stress, their sleep, I guess their exposure to infectious diseases, right? Common cold, flu, whatever. Then what signs and symptoms indicate a failure of the individual's adaptability?
Like in a good way or in a bad way? Or is it kind of the same?
In a bad way. In other words, what would you be on the lookout for that would indicate that someone is in those red dots there in terms of their stress response adaptation?
Extreme muscle soreness, I would say.
Okay. Yeah, all right, definitely. Especially if they've been doing that exercise for a period of time. So if they've, front squats are a normal part of their training, and normally it doesn't make them extremely sore, but suddenly they are becoming extremely sore. Absolutely.
Maybe like a inability to move within like all ranges of motion for either a particular exercise or just kind of across the board.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's another good one. Yeah. So
Or
some
if they get really dizzy while working out or really out of breath.
Okay. Yeah. So unusual fatigue. Sure.
We throw their amenorrhea.
Oh yeah,
Mm-hmm.
that's a
Definitely.
good one. Mhm.
Yeah.
And doesn't when like overtraining, don't you start getting a little like really tired all the time? Like they'll be sleeping 12, 14 hours sometimes.
Yeah. It's interesting because overtraining causes that, but it also causes sleep disturbances.
Yeah. Mhm. So it must be a tough one to really determine.
Mhm. Okay, so
I haven't done much with like Joel Jameson or heart rate variability. If you were to be tracking it via one of those technological devices, would you notice a disruption on there?
mhm. Yeah, you should. You would you'd kind of need to experiment to find a range of where you should normally fall within. So where are you in like a perfectly recovered state? Where are you in an aroused state?
Mhm.
You kind of need to establish an individual baseline. But then, yes, you would see some disturbances if you track heart rate variability, mostly in reductions in heart rate variability.
Okay.
So these are some questions to ponder when you set up a training or when you're monitoring your individual's training. Now into first principle, which is stress response adaptation. I like this quote from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, I think is how you say his name. He wrote a book called Anti-Fragile, another book called Black Swan and Fooled by Randomness. They're great books. They'll put you to sleep, but they're pretty good books. But anyways, he kind of coined this term anti-fragile, and this is systems or objects that increase in capability, resilience, or robustness as a result of stressors, shocks, volatility, mistakes, faults, attacks, or failures, with a big kind of key in there on stressors. So I'm going to show you some images. You can tell me whether they are anti-fragile or not. Anti-fragile or not?
I don't know about that one.
Depends on what you're doing.
The motor probably is not anti-fragile, but if it gets hit by a semi truck, it probably won't hold up very well.
Okay. All right.
What would you say? Is it fragile or anti-fragile?
I would say it is fragile.
Yeah, that's what I think too.
Any sort of stress is going to devalue it. The moment you drive a car off the lot, it's worthless,
Oh,
right?
that's true.
All right. Number two.
Super fragile,
Yeah.
maybe. I
So-
don't know. I guess it depends on who built it.
Well, depends on what coastline that is. Because again, hurricanes and everything else could just.
I lived in South Carolina for 7 years on the coast. 5 years in a row, school was canceled for a hurricane.
Oh, wow.
So remember, we're not talking about simply robust. What we're talking about is the ability, when presented with a stress, to see an increase in resilience, capability, or robustness.
That house would probably survive a hurricane.
Don't
But
think
it won't
of
get
that
any
big, though.
tougher.
Don't think of it that big.
There you go.
It won't get any tougher from
There
it.
you go. Like your skeletal system, that's going to get tougher.
Yeah.
The
That's
mountain
Mount
of giraffe.
Kilimanjaro. No, that's not Mount Kilimanjaro. That's shoot. What's the
Cape
mountain in
Fuji.
Africa?
Fuji? Mount Fuji?
That's a,
Yeah, I think. Wait, no, Fuji's in Japan, right? And Kilimanjaro's in Africa.
yeah. That looks pretty African.
Oh, that's close.
Let's be careful with how we say things there, Katie.
Well, I mean, the trees and stuff.
This is giraffe. Giraffes only live in Africa, as far as
Right,
I'm
this is true. They don't live in
Okay.
Japan.
They're not
There's no
native to-
Japanese giraffes.
anywhere else.
There could be a zoo with a giraffe in Japan. Come on.
So the mountain, is the mountain anti-fragile?
I
That
would-
particular mountain.
I would say so, yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Okay.
definitely anti-fragile. Yes. Been there a long time.
Right, but is its capabilities increasing? Or are they decreasing? Is this robustness increasing or decreasing?
Oh, it's decreasing, I think, over time. A long time though, right?
Right? It's being eroded and
Yes.
weathered. All those
Repeated
stresses aren't
elements.
making it bigger or stronger.
Right.
Okay.
Maybe the giraffe is anti-fragile.
Anti-fragile.
The kid or the dog or the sand? What are we talking about in this
The
one?
child, the human, I guess the dog.
Kid
They're
is
growing.
definitely anti-fragile,
Mhm.
depending, I guess. All
So,
these things depend.
so I think we'd agree that when exposed to stress, only the child, only the two organisms in the bottom right, I guess the giraffe too, but only the two organisms in the bottom right will increase, have the ability to increase their capability, resilience, or robustness. Expose them to some stress and they're likely to come out stronger, especially if that stress is exercise. So stress response adaptation is very easily summed up or thought of as anti-fragility. When a stress is imposed, there is a response, and there's an adaptation. An adaptation should result in an increase in robustness. Now, I like the fitness fatigue model to illustrate stress response adaptation. So fitness can manifest in various ways over various time periods. Potentiation is very brief. Have you heard of post-activation potentiation? Okay. Very easy way to explain this is on a bench press or a squat or whatever, do one really heavy repetition or two really heavy repetitions, and then unload the weight a little bit, maybe take 30 or 40% off, and use a lighter weight. And that weight should feel lighter than it is. That is post-activation potentiation, just very simply explained and experienced. Changes to the muscle itself, both hypertrophy, so increases in size, and architecture, changes in pronation angle occur over days. And then activation can occur over hours to days, neural activation. So after a workout, we see our fitness increase. Even right after a workout, our fitness increases. However, at the same time, right after a workout, we've driven a lot of fatigue into our system. And that fatigue can be metabolic, ion disturbances, the production of inorganic phosphate and other metabolites, hydrogen ions, etc. That usually dissipates within several hours. It can be central and muscular. Central fatigue dissipates within a few hours, and muscular fatigue can persist for days, especially muscle damage and the effects of muscle damage on neural activation. And so if you look at this model, what you can see is after a workout, fitness is elevated, but so is fatigue. And that fatigue is greater than the fitness, and that results in lower performance. However, as time goes on, the fatigue dissipates. And when the fatigue dissipates and the fitness is still elevated, performance is greater. And then if you wait too long, fatigue completely dissipates, and so does fitness, and performance returns to baseline. So performance, as we might manifest it, in other words, after, say, a squat workout, our ability to squat more weight is the sum of our fitness adaptations minus our fatigue effects. Or in very simple terms, when fatigue is less than fitness, performance will be greater. Looking at stress response adaptation under the model of general adaptation syndrome, what we can see here is we have an external load, so the stressor, We have an internal load, the responses of the various different organ systems to that stressor. Then we have performance increasing. In this repetitive work recovery phases, the W stands for work, where essentially proteins are depleted. What we mean by proteins are functional proteins within the muscle. So actin, myosin, myoglobin, various enzymes, etc. And during the recovery phase, or the R, those proteins are resynthesized to a greater degree. And over time, the greater resynthesis in proteins adds up to greater performance. If you can see the box on the top right, what we can see is that different types of exercises result in different types of protein synthesis and responses. And I'll share these slides with Chris as well, so you can share them with you, so you can see them. But we have stress response adaptation in a nutshell, kind of explained on a little bit more of a physiological level. Training causes disturbances. Some of those disturbances result in the functional proteins within the muscle being damaged or disturbed. Recovery resynthesizes those proteins to a greater extent, slightly greater extent, and over many different sessions, this adds up to greater performance. As a very bottom line, simple application, the molecular pathways that are responsible for adaptation take time to express their full adaptive capacity after any single stimulus, usually days. And then training during those times when they are still expressing themselves can blunt their adaptive magnitude. So for example, if you trained your legs every single day, your adaptations would be less than if you allowed your legs to nearly fully recover before you trained them again. In simple terms, adaptations are stimulated in training, but they're really accrued during recovery. So train, recover, nutrition, adapt. In terms of resistance training, the optimal frequency appears to be about once every 48 to 120 hours. So about once every 2 to 5 days, a muscle or movement should be trained. And if we apply the stress response schematic to it, with again, fitness being blue, fatigue being that like teal green color, and performance being red, if we're applying the training sessions at the correct frequency, we can see that training occurs when when fatigue is almost fully dissipated, but fitness and performance are still elevated. And over time, that yields higher performance. And under or overdosing, as you might imagine, would be training the lower body every single day of the week, as you see on the left, or training the lower body not frequently enough, once every 2 weeks, as you see on the right. I want to pause for questions or thoughts.
So if you're talking about overtraining, I mean, I hear a lot that most normal people aren't going to overtrain. But are there certain things that you would look for, like the hierarchy of things that you would look for as in like overtraining? So what's the most obvious thing? I know it probably varies from person to person, but maybe overall, the most obvious signs.
That's a good question. And overtrain, the phenomena of overtraining is certainly real and has been documented. But how we actually go about classifying overtraining in the scientific community is pretty heavily debated. So I like to kind of, let's see here. Think of it like this. We have increases in fitness or performance. And at some point, those increases are going to taper off or start to plateau. Can you see this with the glare okay? All right, cool.
Yeah.
Should you continue to train, especially to increase the intensity and volume or frequency, we'll start to enter a state of functional overreaching. That state of functional overreaching is a reduction in performance. It's usually experienced as you're trying really hard, but you can't perform as well. You may feel some symptoms, additional muscle soreness, fatigue, maybe some slight sleep disturbances, but the symptoms are very mild. And use the red here. If we allow for recovery, then this will happen with functional overreaching. We'll have this supracompensation. So if we take a week to deload or 2 weeks to deload or taper, when we start training again, our performance will rapidly elevate. If we continue training and performance keeps going down, then we enter a state of what's called non-functional overreaching. This can oftentimes be mistaken for overtraining. With non-functional overreaching, several weeks of recovery or deloading will not result in improved performance, and it will take time again to build back up. Overtraining is a state that goes beyond this, where performance goes down, and if you don't get injured in this period, and you actually do reach a state of overtraining, it takes significant periods of time for recovery to return to training and baseline. So overtraining is where, in that general adaptation syndrome model, we've really reached that state of exhaustion. What you can look for is a number of different variables or characteristics. And no one variable or characteristic should be used to determine whether that person is in this non-functional overreaching, entering into overtraining stage. There's blood variables that can be looked at. So looking at inflammatory cytokines and whole blood work, hemoglobin, hematocrit, mean corpuscular value, et cetera. But those tests are generally expensive and not very accessible to everyone. Heart rate variability is another option to use to kind of help determine how recovered the person is. And so if we start seeing heart rate variability just keep declining and declining, and a few days off and a few good nights of sleep and minimizing stress doesn't bring it back up, that's a pretty good indicator that that person may be in that state of non-functional overreaching. You're certainly more susceptible to illness and sleep disturbances and appetite disturbances in that state as well. Really, the best thing you can do, or probably the easiest thing you can do as a professional, is without spending a lot of money on technology, is just track performance and look for ratings of perceived exertion. And so if you're doing essentially the same amount of work and same workouts, and the person's ratings of perceived exertion during those workouts are higher. And if you see them just keep going up, even if you're backing off, then that's a pretty good indicator that you're somewhere in that range or state as well.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. And it might be worth talking to your client as well about what's going on outside of training. And there's studies in college football players that show injuries just go way up around midterm and finals time, which I think goes to show how stress can influence our training response. So kind of playing that soft bed and balancing it out, the stress of everything else with the stress of training.
It's such a hard one to to analyze, because is it because of the excessive amount of stress hormones, or is it because of the lack of sleep? Or is it like the, you know,
Well, so hormones, looking at the testosterone to cortisol ratio is another way to kind of look for this. But I think the hormones are not the cause, but instead a reaction to the stress.
I got you. Okay.
But it all culminates, it all summates into just an overload of stress in the organism, taxing the entire system, really.
I'm always just thinking of how companies will use this as an opportunity to, you know, make a quick buck, or, you know, influencers will say things and they'll take away from it because they don't understand the fundamentals, and they'll just say, oh, cortisol's bad. You need to take this brutal fucking whatever to lower your cortisol levels. And it's like, oh, that's not as simple as that, but that's what the uneducated coach would do.
Yeah, so like stress is the cause of the fire being overtraining syndrome or non-functional overreaching, or just a decline in capabilities, let's say. And then cortisol is kind of like reporters at the scene, or I don't know, maybe firefighters too, in that they're not the cause of it, but they're associated with it. Like firefighters don't cause fires, but anytime there's a fire, there will be firefighters there to deal with it. So that's kind of the same thing with stress and cortisol. Like the release of cortisol in response to stress is a good thing. We need it to liberate fuels and everything else so that we can have our fight or flight response and survive. It's just too much stress, prolonged stress, and then that prolonged cortisol response can negatively affect some of our systems, muscular system, immune system, etc. But yeah, but and even if you like remove someone's adrenal gland so they couldn't produce cortisol, that stress would still be there, having negative effects. I think this is a good stopping point before we can pick up overload in the next session.
Yeah, I need time to process.
Yeah.
My brain is experiencing a little stress. No, I'm just kidding. This is so great. Thank you. Thanks so much for coming on today. This is awesome.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And you can get my email from Chris too if you
Okay.
have questions you haven't thought about.
I wrote down a question, and if this is too much, or if you want to start on the next one, I wanted to make sure that I was on the right path when we were talking about genes and how even twins have different genes in a certain degree. Now, you can change type 2X fibers to like type 2A, or that's not possible?
You can, as best we know, because it's very difficult to study this in humans. To measure fiber type, you need to take a muscle biopsy. As far as I'm aware, still the only way to do it. And you need to take the muscle biopsy in the exact same spot each time to look at the changes in muscle fiber type. So we're not taking the muscle biopsy in the exact same spot. And so that means we might be taking different fibers for analyzation. And so really what we're looking at is the ratios of what's analyzed. And so when we make these kind of determinations that fiber types can or cannot change within or between, it's based upon some assumptions. But the most recent research seems to show that not only can, so we have our our fiber types.
And are we, as from what I've learned and what I teach with the NSCA and keeping up with like Schoenfeld's work, is it definitive that humans have roughly 7 types, or is it?
Yeah.
That's what you're writing right now. Okay, yeah.
So we have, as far as we know, we have 5
Okay.
type 2s. That's what, type 1 and 1C, something, I think. I don't know, I'm much more concerned with the type 2s and as a strength guy. But it's pretty well accepted that any sort of training causes these type 2 X's to transition this way toward type 2 XA and type 2A. Those type 2 X muscle fibers are super powerful, but they have minimal endurance. So any type of training that you do that involves anything really causes them to become more 2XA and 2A. We really only see these, as far as I'm aware, in sedentary individuals mostly. So the type of training we do will cause our muscle fiber types to shift in one direction or another. So doing a lot of aerobic training or endurance training will cause our muscle fiber types to shift in this direction. Most powerful, least endurance. Most endurance, least powerful of the type 2s. Just as a side note, what's interesting is tapering and deloading will cause a shift back in this direction. We may actually see some type 2X muscle fibers reappear, which is maybe explains some of the supracompensation effects in terms of strength and power, like tapering power athletes, throwers, power lifters, Olympic weightlifters, etc. But to Chris's question, there is emerging research that we can have shifts between fibers so that type 2s could shift to type 1s and vice versa. This was once thought not possible.
Okay.
But it now appears that it is possible. But again, we're limited in how we can make these assessments. Like really the only way we could truly do this is to dissect someone's quad. And you can only dissect someone's quad once.
Yeah. I remember when I was at UConn, they had that. That was like one of the coolest things as an intern, because they'd give you $1,000 per prick and you would get 3 of them. And so as a college student, you get $3 grand, you can go drink, and it was like a big old party. But at that time, I remember a couple of my professors were saying it was not possible to have that shift. And so that's what's neat about just always be learning and keeping up with the current literature, is that maybe that is not the case anymore.
Yeah, Andy Galpin does a lot of research in this area.
Okay.
And he does a pretty good job too of breaking it down and sharing his research in the area on social media in a way that's pretty digestible and understandable to non-scientists.
Yeah, such as us. So I had a great call with him, and he was. Are you familiar with Duncan French?
Yeah, the MMA guy.
Yeah. So Duncan was under Kramer at UConn, and And I've been trying to link up with him because I just like to have the diversity of, different coaches out there and learn from, because MMA is such an interesting sport because of the demands from the physical, mental, and bioenergetic level. So
Yeah, planning for MMA is a nightmare for lower level MMA athletes because they could have like a fight pop up at any moment, or you might peak them for a fight and then their competitor drops out like last moment too.
So this is great. I will touch base with everyone and I'll gather some questions that maybe I can shoot over for you that when we determine the next time when you have the availabilities, and we'll pick up from there. And again, really appreciate your time. This has been awesome. And thank you for everything, Doc.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I will stick around for a few minutes if anyone wants to ask any questions, or if you want to talk about your day or anything that's going on. This is going to be recorded, so I'll send it out to everyone. So
I log off now. Oh,